And shalom, welcome. My name is Rabbi Johnny Solomon, and I'm delighted to welcome Rabbi Ari Kahn to talk about his recently published book, The Crowns on the Letters. I've got all these notes here. I really enjoyed reading it. And we've got a few questions to explore and a whole range of issues to discuss. So firstly, Rabbi Kahn, I want to say how much I enjoyed reading, or more specifically learning this wonderful book. Unlike certain books which focus on Talmudic narratives but which overlook textual details in their attempt to capture meaning and drama, or other books which focus heavily on textual detail which fail to capture or communicate spiritual meaning and human drama. What I felt in The Crowns on the Letters is that you seamlessly communicated both the meaning and the drama of many Talmudic passages without compromising on the details brought out by the text or the commentaries. So my first question to you is twofold. What led you to develop this method? And secondly, having noted in your introduction that some of the ideas in this work are of recent vintage, while others have been percolating for close to 40 years, can you tell me a little about the evolution of some of the ideas and insights in this book?
Okay, that's a long, complex question, I see. As far as the method goes, there is an assumption, which maybe is a good assumption, maybe not. And perhaps readers will have more of appreciation than I will, because I'm standing inside it and they're outside. Mm-hmm. Was there really a unified method within the entire book? Or were there multiple methods being used, or were different methods being used in different places? I'm not sure how to answer that. I know how I learn, but I don't necessarily know of every, and you know as well, that when you learn a sugya, you learn a regular, which I think is very important for this discussion. Essentially, the backdrop of all of this were sugyot in the Gemara. Mm-hmm. And we are more used to learning Gemara, and when I say we, we're talking about this fraternity of rabbis, that we learn Gemara when we're looking to understand the passage itself on its own, or when sometimes we go backwards and we want to understand the halacha. Mm-hmm. And we know what we're doing. And again, sometimes going backwards or forwards makes a very big difference. But if we're trying to research a particular issue, so sometimes you end up in the Rambam, and sometimes a little turn of phrase in the Rambam will end up opening the thing up. And sometimes you're going to end up in a tshuva of Ravadia, you're going to end up in the Shagid Aryeh, you're going to end up someplace else. And therefore, it's interesting to talk about methodology. It could be that somebody giving a shir in halacha or in Gemara over the course of his man or a semester, as it may be, they may end up teaching 12 different topics with 12 different methodologies that were used because each thing lent itself to something else. And at the end of this man, I wonder what exactly the Talmud took away from it. What did he learn in terms of a methodology as such? Yes, we teach people how to read, and we teach them how to pay attention. And that's one thing which I was very, very careful about, was language. And for me, if something didn't fit into the words, then it doesn't fit. It may be a nice idea, but it doesn't fit. And what I was trying to do, as much as we can speak in such a sense, of getting to pshat and getting to what it would said. Now, I'm fully aware of the dilemma within all of art. To what extent are we interested in what the artist intended and to what the person viewing the art sees? So one of the things that I was doing along the line is making an assumption, which I think many academics will attack me for if they bother reading it. And that is that I can take 6 different Gemarot about Rabbi Akiva, and from a Yerushalmi, from a Bavli, from a Vata Rabbi Natan, and make an assumption that there's one larger narrative which is taking place over here. So therefore, if you're going to ask me honestly, have I therefore uncovered the historical Rabbi Akiva? Oshakain Oshalo, what I have worked on is the way that Rabbi Akiva has been dealt with within rabbinic literature. Now, the academic is going to get stuck on this issue. Hold it. Which layer is this from? And which Beit Midrash produced this? And what's going? But that didn't interest me, because I wasn't interested in the deconstruction. I was interested in the construction. And therefore, my construction is, what does the Talmudic literature say to me? And here is my assumption that there is a singular voice within it. And then I'm trying, and now if you think about that for a second, I think that's the way we learn regular Gemara. When I say regular, I'm talking about halacha. I don't look at a particular point, oh, no, that came from that Beit Midrash and that was said at this particular time. No, we learn. So essentially, what was the big chidush in my methodology? I approach Agadah the same way that we approach halacha.
I mean, you are, in a follow-up question, you are careful about words, and And there are times where there are textual variants, and you pay attention to that, which I'd say some people either are unfamiliar with that area of research. For you, it's important to know what could this text be saying, and you acknowledge that on occasion, perhaps what we have in the Vilna Shas may not be necessarily the more accurate text, not in grand scale, but certainly in terms of a handful of words here and there. You're prepared to use academic, authoritative versions of texts. And I'd say that makes you slightly different from perhaps some people teaching yeshivot and seminaries, some rabbis. For you, text is important, and you want to treat it with integrity, and you want to see the integrity of the text. Is that right?
It's true, but I would find it hard to believe that somebody who teaches exclusive yeshiva would feel uncomfortable with what I've done. I don't want to get grandiose, but how different from what I did is from the Vilna Gaon did. And of course, the Vilna Gaon does it most likely, misfara,
Yes.
and I'm doing it from text. But again, my approach was not academic in the sense of being hyper focused on this, but rather along the way, there were some issues that needed to be ascertained.
Right. Now, to the second question, I mean, you spoke about some of these shirim basically, what was your word, percolating over your mind for 40 years. So tell me how that works. It means I presume you learned that sugya, you learned that story, or you heard it in it, and it piqued an interest, and you revisited it time and again. And did you then build layers and new layers of understanding of that story? Or did you have certain personalities? You have certain personalities you have a keen interest in, you're always looking out for because they speak to you.
So I'm not sure how to answer that. Because clearly there's some kind of combination. Some of these things that because they drew interest, and because I thought there were important messages involved, and that's also a part of it, is that on the most part, not necessarily all of them, but on the most part, I chose really well-known teachings, agadot. And a pet peeve that I have is the more well-known it is, the more likely that it's been misrepresented along the way, the more likely it was taken out of context, the more likely one or two key lines were taken out, and then probably agenda driven. And by the way, the person doing it may know or may not know, because it's hashkafically driven, and this is what Chazal say in this particular point, and the reality is they may be very, very off the mark. So I often took things which I thought were really central, and if I didn't have one, they put in like the lives of the sages. That was not part of my original title. I would have put a subtitle more to the extent of the crowns, the letters, and a modern Jewish theology.
Actually, we're going to be getting right to that in a few questions' time, because theology isn't something you briefly mention. It's actually embedded significantly in the telling and the interpretation of a lot of these Talmudic passages. In fact, I'm gonna jump to that question now, even though it wasn't the order that I put them in, because it really did interest me. So peppered within your analysis of various Talmudic passages, you make a number of significant historical or theological statements. For example, in terms of Revelation, you say that Moshe did not receive a written account of events before they transpired. Now, for me, that may not be shocking, but for some people, you're making a very absolute statement about something which they may not be so certain about. They may have heard various traditions and say, really? I thought the Moshe was given everything at Har Sinai, including that which happened ahead of time. And so by making those statements, it's clear that you believe that there is significant ambiguity among some Orthodox Jews about some of these central Jewish beliefs. So to your mind, why do you think so many Orthodox Jews are confused about so many core beliefs?
Because their teachers are confused.
Right.
No offense, present company excluded, of course.
No, listen, I think there's a really important conversation that it's extraordinary how expert a person can be, as you say, in studying Gemara or being able to decipher halakha. But when it comes down to theology, even those who are considered to be expert Torah teachers really kind of communicate very, very vague ideas, which are, I wouldn't say thoughtless, but don't demonstrate a profound level of thinking in their way of presenting.
Well, think a second about Agadot. In yeshiva, it's generally skipped. And
Yep.
if it's not skipped, then it's just read through quickly. And when it's skipped, one of two messages are conveyed depending on the individual. Either this is of no importance and that's why we're skipping it, or this is very, very deep and we can't understand it and therefore we'll skip it. But either way, it's not taught. So therefore, I do believe that the Agadot contain authentic Jewish theology. And therefore, if we want to understand theology, we need to understand the Agadot. And that's really what it comes down to, was the purpose of this book, or the Sefer, as I think you correctly call it, is in order to try to understand theology on its own terms, instead of people cherry picking and looking for certain lines and say, oh, this proves this particular point. If I recall, and you read this book more recently than I did, that when I made this point regarding the sequence and when Moshe received what, I said that it would be a theological nightmare, right? I think that was my term. It would be theological.
Yeah, I have a note, a sticker somewhere.
It would be a theological nightmare to consider that Moshe actually was told that he would hit the rock before he hit the rock. Because if he was told that he would do it, then there's determinism, and why should he be punished for it? Because this was preordained. And if it wasn't preordained, then why would a sane person go ahead and do something, understanding what the consequences would be? And either way, you're going to end up with, as I said, a theological nightmare, which I don't see any way of creeping out of. There was also a really important footnote there somewhere along the line. I don't know how studiously anybody reads footnotes, but there was a wonderful example from the Maharal. Now, the Maharal knows very well that in the beginning of Parshat Bahar, Rashi makes the observation that everything was taught Sinai, right? That this comes to teach you that the specifics and the generalities and so on, everything was taught from Sinai. But nonetheless, immediately before this, we had the example of the Mekalel, and Moshe didn't know what to do with the Mekalel. So the Maharal asks, how could Moshe not know what to do with the Maharal, with Mekalel, if everything was taught me Sinai, which actually is, he goes, no, everything was taught by Sinai, but it really sounds like in theory, but not in practice. So, okay, so that's a really interesting comment of the Maharal, but I think it's also very telling. He's saying, don't think that Moshe received the narrative. He didn't know the narrative. He knew once he learned the narrative, then he understood where to put this in within a larger context, but he did not know the narrative at all. But it's fascinating because the Maharal says that within the context of Moshe having received details.
So firstly, thank you so much for explaining that. And going back to your point about Agadah, when I was young, and perhaps I thought more than I did, but I wrote a newspaper article actually making the argument of why yeshivot don't teach Agadah. And one of my revered teachers gave one of those two answers, which is we don't know how to interpret Agadah, so be quiet, Johnny, and move on. And what you've done, and perhaps there have been a lot of people who have provided a lot of misunderstanding. They have allowed cherry picking. In fact, they've modeled it to the point that because there's so much confusion, this has been avoided. What the Crown on the Letters does is provide a masterclass in how to read Agadah, meaning you're not just giving tremendous amount of insights, you're walking the learner through how to think in terms of connecting with and interpreting these texts and texts like this. And what you're telling is there are lots of clues and there are lots of important commentaries. And don't be presumptuous and take your time. And in fact, as you say, sometimes it takes almost, a half a lifetime or a third of a lifetime to achieve that level of understanding. So thank you. I mean, it's a great contribution to the Jewish bookshelf. And I say I very much enjoyed learning it. Going back to your second chapter, and you spend time exploring the drama and the meaning of this vision that Moshe has given of him sitting in the Bet Midrash of Rabbi Akiva. And there, it's beautiful. You describe how Moshe sees what's going on. And what I want to ask you is, when you are learning Gemara and when you're writing in this way and delivering your shiurim, are you looking at these texts or are you in these texts?
It's an interesting question. There are things that I've written, including in this book, but there are things that I've written that subsequently people have told me, and maybe you can guess some of the things, I believe you've read some of them, that people have told me, when I read that, there were tears coming down my face. And I said, I know exactly why that is, because when I wrote it, there were tears coming down my face. So therefore, if you ask me if I'm inside, I'm absolutely inside.
It's a beautiful thing, um, and I think we don't speak enough about the experience of learning authentically, that you're so connected within the text. I gave a share about Rav Soloveitchik as a teacher, and I know he was one of your revered teachers. And he remarks, and I've got the quote in the Daf Makorot, but I'm not going to pull it out now. But what he did was model learning with students by authentically learning with students, meaning they didn't see him doing revision of text. They saw him encountering text, and that itself was a masterclass in somebody authentically connecting and being not just with, but in stories and laws and analyses that mean something to them. And I think that's, at least according to some of the testimonies I've heard from their students, that was the most remarkable thing. It wasn't just the ideas, it was seeing a teacher being moved by the things that they wish to teach. That's the lesson.
I'll go one step further. There were a number of times I would teach these chapters as well. So, for example, when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai comes and visits Rabbi Akiva in the class in the prison, I've asked my students, in order to get to a point of interpretation, I said, okay, I want you now to imagine yourselves that you're in that room. I want you to look around. Tell me what you see. Describe the room for me. And a number of times I've asked them, okay, if you were going to film this, you're going to produce this, tell me, and tell me again how you would lay this out. How, even the one that you mentioned before, Rabbi Akiva and Moshe Rabbeinu, I've asked them, if this were a play, how many act play it is. Can you describe going from one to the other? And I very much try to take them into the room itself as well as the events are transcribing. What music do you hear? What music do you hear in the background?
Right.
I mean, if you imagine this, I've asked, it's not in this book, but I've asked, when Moshe is above receiving the finishing touches on the Seret Dibrot, and Am Yisrael's below dancing around the Egel, so what music is playing in each one of those venues? So I said, I would imagine something very classical, perhaps a violin concerto up in heaven, maybe with strings, maybe but something very, very ethereal. And down below, you have heavy rock taking place. You have something with a lot of percussion, and there's it's body music perhaps as opposed to soul music. But I very much take my students there in order to try to feel, in a real sense, what is it which is taking place. And if to any extent I succeeded in this book by doing this as well, then I'm very pleased.
I'm very, very moved by your descriptions and by these ideas. You're bringing the third dimension back into the text. You're helping the learner be in that moment. When I spoke about Rav Soloveitchik, he speaks about this experience of the Torah teachers being in the room, right? And you're saying you are going into that room. You're there in the base medrash, you're there at the mountain, and that pathos is palpable in what you write, and you feel it as a learner. And that's really very majestic. You spoke, and I love the chapter about Rabbi Lazar ben Arach, which communicated some profound ideas about outreach. And I know you've worked in and have considerable connection to the outreach world. So I wanted to ask you, can you give us a brief insight into this story and what you think it can teach us today about outreach rabbis and outreach methods?
Okay, so a couple of points. One, this is one of the essays which is 40 years old. This is one before I ever was involved in outreach. So consider that for a moment, because there could have been some assumptions there along the way.
But right at the end, you refer to Noach Weinberg. Do you remember?
Yes. I learned with him b'chavruta at one point, and he would call me up every now and then and ask me for makarot and ask me for things, and we had a very interesting relationship. And one time we were learning together, and it was a Sunday morning, and we were learning, and he told me he has a headache and he can't really concentrate. So I said, you know what? Let me run this by you, and that was the context of that taking place. And of course, his question was he successful? But again, this particular approach predated my ever being involved in any type of outreach. The second point is, I would prefer to answer your question about outreach and rabbis and methodology and so on in context with a different chapter in the book. and
Sure.
that is Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish.
My pleasure.
I think it's more important. But as far as the tension over here, I felt that very much we can relate to Rabbi Lezer ben Arach and his colleagues and his teacher, because essentially it's a post-Holocaust generation.
Mm.
And what happens when a spiritual world is destroyed? And now we have to now pick up that spiritual world. And essentially what I tried to point at, and I think I brought a lot of evidence. Again, that chapter, you can either accept my conclusions or not, but I thought that the case that I brought was quite strong, especially at the very end, bringing that Rabbi Akiva himself speaking about it.
Yes.
If you know what I'm referring to, that his finger itself would outweigh all the other rabbis. I thought that was really quite strong, and that I found much later. That was like one of like the last pieces of that, and that's also what happened. There's lots of layers to what I was doing, because along the way I would constantly revise and find more and more. I mean, I'll tell you this personally, because nobody else is listening, I'm sure, and that is, I can assure you that the last time that I went through Daf Yomi, the last Daf Yomi, I went through with the book already completely written, and I went through every single page and every single sugya with the entire book in mind, in order of making reservations or making sure that everything I have here is consonant with everything within Shas.
Hmm.
So,
Wow.
okay. So again, I don't even know if you imagine such a thing, but yes, that's what I was doing, learning through all of Shas just to make sure, and it wasn't my first time, but making sure that everything over here will at least not be contradicted in an obvious way to something which is there. So that's, and along the way, I found more evidence, and along the way, added footnotes. And now you see why I had too many footnotes and too many endnotes and too much information that ended up having to be limited a little bit. But go back to the post-Holocaust generation, which I think we can still appreciate and understand, because we're not so removed from that. In our world, and by the way, I don't know what year you were born. I was born in 1960,
So I'm
and
76, so I'm a
okay,
little younger.
I was born in 1960. But my point about 1960, I'd say to my students, I was born 15 years after the war ended.
Yeah.
That's not an enormous amount of time. Although growing up, we never felt it. We didn't know it. Although there were lots and lots of kids who had European parents. And any kid with a European parent with an accent, it really meant that they had survived the war.
Mm.
That's really what it was. And it was a way of just dividing. And only 15 years. Now, what do you do after this war? You have a Jewish people who've been decimated in terms of numbers. You have entire communities that have disappeared. You have that tune that they used in Lachadod, in that little town outside of Pinsk, which nobody remembers anymore. So you have Jews who are depressed, Jews who are deflated, and you have Torah, which has been weakened because of all the yeshivot which are gone. So now what do you do? And I use that really in order to understand Elazar ben Arach. The tension is between Am Yisrael versus Torah Yisrael, and which is more important? And the answer is both are more important. And that's what I felt that Elazar ben Arach really did, is be diligent to study Torah on the one hand, but on the other hand, know how to answer the person who's lost their faith. And I
Right.
and I think that that's what his life was involved in both. So yes, there is certainly an aspect of outreach, but it's very different outreach. It's not an outreach for the person who's lost their faith because of their freedoms, which I think is really the generation that we're dealing with now. It's that the competition is not the Holocaust; the competition is hedonism. So therefore, it's a very different type of experience. And there is a footnote there about the relationship between Epicurean versus hedonism and so
Yes.
on, if you recall. But with Reish Lakish, I thought it was more important, because there is a tendency of people. Now, I don't know right now if I'm about to say is true of the people teaching, and I suspect it is, but also the people who become Baalei Tshuva, which is a terrible term. Baalei Tshuva meant beforehand there were Baalei Avera. How in the world can we have an attitude and really believe that you have a generation of Tinuk Shenishba and then say that they're Baalei Tshuva? I would be far more comfortable if we came up with a new term. Call them nouveau frum. Call them something else. Don't call them Baalei Tshuva, because they were never Baalei Avera. And that, what takes place very often, is a rejection of who I was, a rejection of the past, and therefore their whole lives are of no value. And that's why I thought the Rabbi Yochanan statement, "Chelech li'araita," don't reject who are you, use your capabilities. If you've gone through these experiences, you've become a certain person, don't reject that person, elevate that person. Again, don't reject the sin, elevate the sin, turn the sin into some kind of positive energy. And I think that is a critique. And again, I'm not going to critique the people necessarily who are teaching, although I think a lot of them do this. They break the person down. They break down who they were. They make them feel like they're nothing. And then instead of being a successful something, now they become a third-rate yeshiva student. And there's something which is incredibly damaging about that. And what we need is a different type of energy over there in order to make this person not feel that he's about tshuva, not make feel that he was about avera, but rather he's somebody who's gone through some type of metamorphosis. And that's a better term, chelech le'oraita. Now, how do we use our strength for Torah? And I think that the person would be healthier, and I think that the community would be healthier if we approached it that way.
Well, I can only say I agree. And I've seen that far too often. And I know that whoever is listening to this, and I'll try and share some quotes from our conversation, will be, I think, inspired and uplifted by that approach. And a lot of people have been lost. They've lost themselves. It's not about loss to the people. By staying close to people, they've lost themselves, and that's a real tragedy. I want to pivot to a slightly different question about.
I want to continue on that point for 1 second.
Okay.
Because as educators, it's very important for us as well not to take every one of our students and turn them into us. Rather, we need to take our students and see their capabilities. And they have lots of different capabilities they walk in with. Again, they are 3rd, 4th, 5th-rate yeshiva students or seminary girls. They don't know how to learn, but that doesn't mean they don't have other capabilities. Mm-hmm. And the process of learning should be one of using those capabilities as we learn together and value what they're bringing through, not just as a sales pitch, but value what each person has. And I just think that the whole learning process will be a lot healthier.
I absolutely agree. And obviously, the more you know the student, the more you can get to help. And that's why conversations outside of class are invaluable. I did, in my master's, I did a case study of the impact of outside of classroom encounters on religious growth. I'm not talking about Shabbos. I'm saying the schmoozes, where a teacher gets to know a student, I mean, we kind of know anecdotally, but what I try to argue on an academic level, these are hugely important. It's where people get to understand who they are and get guided, coached, but not manipulated to use who they are to grow within the learning journey they're on.
So did you analyze the difference between teachers versus other role models, which may be closer? Let's say a madricha as opposed to the teacher, and what impact each has? Because my suspicion is the madrichim and madrichot have much more impact than we do as teachers, because we're on a different level as far as they're concerned.
So it was a case study, so it wasn't a thesis. My thesis was on smartphones and use in yeshivot and seminaries, but definitely those distinctions were drawn from the interviews I had, and 100%. This wasn't just teachers; it was members of a seminary family in that respect, and that means administrators, madrichot, play a tremendously crucial role. Students sometimes have a different perception of teachers, and so it's about the very fact that you're schmoozing with me in your time means that I feel that you value me as a personality, and that was a big boost sometimes to self-esteem of a student. But certainly the encounters and experiences of doing a whole range of activities with a whole range of the support staff are tremendously important, and it's something which needs to happen. And I know this year in Corona, in many ways, certain experiences have been curbed, and in other ways, actually more of those outside of learning experiences have had to replace some of the more traditional tiolim and classes. And so it'll be interesting to see how those experiences differ from this year to others. So in the Crowns and the Letters, you quote from Talmudic, Hasidic, academic, and mystical sources. Your footnotes are rich from many different people, from many different parts of the Jewish world. And it's clear that while you think and write within the realm of rationalism, I'd say, I mean, in many ways you write like an academic, but I don't think you already made an illusion. I don't think you're seeing yourself as a pure academic, but never, there is a respect for text and authenticity and accuracy. You also have a Hasidic or mystical leaning in how you interpret some Talmudic narratives. Still, when talking about Ben Azai, you say the Talmudic treatment of Pardes was an attempt to address many of the problematic results of immersion in mystical pursuits. So I wanted to ask you, how do you balance the two elements in your approach of the rational and the, shall we say, Hasidic mystical, which are expressed not just in this work, but your other works as well?
First of all, I want to protest against Hasidic as a category, especially as you, my good friend from a Sephardic background. I'm profoundly disappointed because I would prefer to say 18th and 19th century thinkers, but I'll quote a Ben Yehoyada the same way that I would quote a Balatanya. And by the way, the importance over here is that for me, they're the same. It's not the Hasidic master that I'm looking for as a Hasidic text, as some people may read them. I am looking at people who are looking at the text that I'm looking at, which I think is important. And I strongly suspect that many people who are think that what they like is Hasidic writings. If you put a Ben Yehoyada, you put some, they would not know the difference. Or for that matter, if you put a lot of 18th century writers in front of them, they would not be able to distinguish between somebody who is quote unquote a Litvak versus somebody who's quote unquote somebody's from Galicia, somebody's from Poland, somebody. So for that matter, or Syria or Iraq, and therefore the distinctions I don't particularly appreciate. I understand, especially today, the need that for people to put into that kind of category. But I've dealt with Hasidic writers and Hasidic texts, but I never dealt with Hasidism per se within the work. Mystical sources, again, Zohar and others, yes, and my other books as well. I've done the same, but that is because I'm looking for something, and more often than not, I know what I'm looking for. And for whatever reasons, those are the writers, right? Which means for me, more often than not, I know exactly what I know what I want to say. But let me find somebody else who said it as well, and those are the writers who have said it. So therefore, I'll bring them in the notes. But I've come to that understanding myself. And sometimes I can be very specific. Sometimes I can say I know Rabbi Nachman is going to say this. I never saw the source, but I know Rabbi Nachman is going to say this. And again, as I said before, the Ben Yehoyada, which by the way, I think he's one of the best in terms of his sensitivity to reading text. His answers, you need to enter into his world, but his sensitivity of questions are wonderful. There's also another work that I've quoted a lot, the Torah Chaim, Chaim Shor, who's also the sensitivity of text. So what brings me to those places, because those are the books that are discussing the issues which I've discussed over here. But to get more to your point, and perhaps a little bit more about Ben Azai, is, or how I find balance myself, rational and mystical and so on. It's interesting because different people see different parts of me. And I'm a rabbi of a shul. So the people in the shul see me, I think, more so for halacha than they'll see me for other things, which may sound interesting. One of the things that I do is I'm one of the poskim for Zaka, and I deal with all kinds of life and death and Shabbat and other kinds of issues. So this whole book actually has very little to do with what I'm spending a lot of my time dealing with, which then may be interesting. But for me, the balance between learning halacha and learning machshava is a very healthy balance. I know if Cook wrote about it in one place where he almost says that the Agadah or Machshava brings him up to heaven and the halacha brings him down to earth. And I maybe I don't get as high into heaven as he does, but I understand that. With Machshava, you can end up saying anything. And maybe you can convince somebody. With halacha, maybe there are people that do that, but we know that there are rules and there are ways that you have to approach it. And at the end of the day, there are boundaries to this, and you have to rule within particular boundaries. And the balance, therefore, takes place with the larger religious experience of learning these different types of texts. But that's exactly what the challenge of Ben Azai was, the way that at least I read it, was that for him, leading a normative Jewish life after his Pardes experience was something which, and anybody who hasn't read the chapter will have no idea what I'm talking about. By the way, that chapter originally was submitted as a possible idea for a thesis, for a master's, and sat on the person's desk for 3 years. And at the end, he said, I don't know what to do with this. So what I did want to try to prove is that there was a pre-Pardes and a post-Pardes Ben Azai, and here is when I finally came back to that. So again, this was years and years and years ago when I first came up with this idea of the two parts of the Ben Azai personality, and I think it works very well within the text as well. But that exactly is what the problem is that once the life isn't normative, and once again, as he tells us that he can't be involved in Pru Revu, so then there's a problem right then having him as the role model, and everything else follows from that.
So firstly, thank you. And it's actually a great chapter. It really changes when people talk about Alvin Mesilah Pardes, they make a whole range of presumptions, which you realize even the text doesn't support it, meaning forget all the other commentaries. If you just read the Gemara, that's not what really happens. And most people don't bother than reading a couple of lines in, and
How
then
about
you
people
completely reshape it.
How about people thinking that Pardes means Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod, which is a 13th or 14th century approach? Nobody knew that earlier.
Right. Just I wouldn't say push back. I take your point on board in terms of Sephardic versus Hasidic. I mean, I do have, of course, Ben Yehoyada. I mean, I'm born Sephardi. My ancestors come from Iraq, meaning that's the kind of neck of the woods I'm from. I do personally draw partial distinctions. I think Hasidic writings do come with a greater layer of theologies associated with it beyond necessarily the mystical texts and thinking. But I do agree that you can find equally rich and equally creative ideas in Sephardic Hasidic writings. I would say something of interest, not that I can necessarily claim to be an advocate, that although there's a great popularity of Hasidic Torah interpretations, most people are totally unaware of that kind of genre of Sephardic Torah commentary, which is exquisite and wonderful as well. Ben Yehoyada, of course, is on Shas, although he wrote on Torah in various different works too, but he's one of many great Torah scholars. And I think it'll be interesting if people explore a little bit more of that area of the bookshelf. That's not to disagree with your point, actually, it's to agree with it, that there's so many great writers from Morocco, from North Africa, from Iraq, and that kind of world, whose insights do blend this kind of creative readings, but which are still rooted in a certain textual discipline, although often a mystical one. So I suppose my final question is, what's next? I mean, this is an outstanding book, not just teaching wonderful readings of Agadic stories, but demonstrating, giving a masterclass as to how to read and how to learn. So what's the next project?
Who knows? I have a whole nother volume of this written, but I don't know if you've put out any books. Books are very painful, and they take lots and lots of time to produce. And if I want to start up with my wife, I'll tell her that children only took 9 months to produce, and this takes far longer. I have a whole nother volume which is tentatively called Arib Mistarim, like a lion in hiding, where I get to stick my name into a title finally, and it's about the Agadot of the Churban.
I think you were recently writing about it. You were thinking out loud about it somewhere on social media.
Perhaps I've mentioned it, but I have a whole manuscript. I mean, that's really the issue. I have a whole manuscript written, but between having a manuscript written to having a manuscript completed takes a lot of time. So that's really going to be the question. Will I then put all my energy to finish this up, or will I leave it there and play again, like I did with this one, play with this a little bit till I finish it? Another thing that I want to work on is something which I started writing. I have a title, and I need to put a lot more work into it, but it is a book on halacha, which is tentatively called halacha for a broken, what do you call it, for, I forgot which words. That wasn't for a broken world, but for an imperfect world. Halacha for an imperfect world. And part of it is because when we teach halacha, we tend to teach for the ideal situations. And maybe that is one of the issues in terms of Corona, that we've just had a whole year of, or almost a year of not perfect situations. But I decided this long ago that we need to teach, we need to educate, not just when things are perfect. I mean, part of this came was crystallized for me when I had attended a Yom Zikaron commemoration in my community. And in my community, there are a number of people who've lost children. Miriam Peretz is a neighbor. She's lost two sons. And there are a number of other people. And there was one fellow who davens in my shul who's a wonderful young man. He's got these long payot, and he's in the army now. I'll say too much information, I'll get into trouble. But by this celebration or commemoration in our neighborhood, which is not a religious one, then it's not a religious neighborhood. I'll say it's the commemoration was the one by the Moitza, and there were girls who would get up and sing during these interludes. I don't believe there's ever a soloist, or if you want to get into, but he walked out every time there was a girl singing. So the next week in shul, I gave a shiur without mentioning him or anything about it. I mentioned the experience, and I said the shiur is kol isha in a b'diavad situation. Okay, everyone learns what do you do in the chatchila situation. Okay, now what do we do in a b'diavad situation? And what is the core? Where does it come from? Again, it's quite ironic because the heter that many people utilize regarding the height of the mechitza, or saying kiddush if a woman's hair is uncovered, the whole analysis of that is actually based upon kol isha. It's all based on leniencies of kol isha that we then bring over to se'ar isha, but then we forgot to use them by kol isha, which I think is fascinating.
Okay, well, I love learning Agadah, and especially this is my first time not just going through Daf Yomi, trying to write something, so you very much whet my appetite, but I suppose my heart is even more rooted in exploring halakha and dealing with the realities of aligning what we have in our great works of halakha and the challenges we face. That, as you say rightly, in relation to Elazar ben Arach, and we saw in the Rashi last week's parsha, the Reishit of Am Yisrael and the Reishit of Torah, and trying to figure out how to balance the two. And I think there's certainly great need for a work like that, but most certainly volume 2 of the Crowns on the Letters, or Avim Mistarim, however you wish to call it, we're very much looking forward to in time, without pressure, you publishing it, and you should be matzliach. And thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'll just say on a personal level, although we don't even know each other that much personally, but we've corresponded many times over the years, you're very, very generous with your time and with your insights and your advice. And I want to personally thank you because it means a lot to me, and I know a lot of other people as well.
Well, thank you for taking the time to reading this. Thank you for taking the time to think about it. I mean, there's a process goes on. People can just read. And you identified a major issue that this is not a book, it's a sefer. And people are not used to reading Sfarim in English. And the truth is there are not very many books like this in Hebrew either. Yeah. And at some point, maybe that's really what the next thing is. I would have thought having 5 Israeli children that one of them would be able to translate. They can't read my books, by the way. I just want you to understand this. We've been living here for 35 years. My grandchildren are Israeli. They can't read anything that I write, and I can't write properly in Hebrew. And my son, my oldest son, who's a Talmid Chacham, and he taught in a Hesed yeshiva for a number of years. So he's capable. I don't know if his English is good enough, but I would hope that at some point we're able to get some of this translated into Hebrew, because I think that there's a huge audience over here who would find it meaningful. And I just want to say one more thing. I very much like this book, and I think it's a very important book. My wife, who perhaps gets more carried away than I do, thinks it's the most important book in terms of Jewish theology written over many, many years. I'm not going to argue, but what I do want to say, because it sounds terribly immodest, and therefore what I want to add to that is that I feel very much as a kli. I feel very much as a kli that God gave me somehow this capability, and it's a zchut of the people who read, and the zchut of the people who learn this, and the zchut of the people who study with me, and God has chosen to use me as a kli. So for that, I am I'm very thankful, and I really do feel that when we're willing to be a kli, then God fills us up, because God needs kelim, which are full of important things. And it's really the zchut of teaching in all these forms. When I made Aliyah, we had just gotten married. Mm-hmm. It was 1 week. We had Sheva Brachot, and our last Sheva Brachot was on the way to the airport, and we came to Israel. Wow. So we started here. And my sense was, I was in the Rav Shir at that point for 3 years. And my sense was if I stayed in America, I probably could have had a career in the rabbinate or something along those lines. And I was very unsure of what would happen over here. But we've wanted to be here to the extent that I was willing to do whatever it meant to do. And if that meant to be a gym teacher, if that meant to clean, whatever it is, and we wanted to be here. And I never imagined that I would have the zchut of teaching and impacting the amount of people that I've had. And for anybody, when they go off against the internet, how terrible the internet is and all the terrible things, well, the internet allowed me and many, many other people today to be able to teach, especially now in the time of Corona, to touch people all over the world and to communicate with them. And I think that's really the issue, is that those of us who are willing to go and teach, God says, okay, let me give you a hand. Let me help you. If you're already going to teach, let me give you something good to say. There's somebody in the audience who needs to hear something. Let me give you the idea that you should say. Let me open up the book to the right page. Let me show you exactly what it is that you should be saying. And I'm very, very thankful to have been this kind of kli. And my bracha to you is that you be a kli, which is malay v'gadush, and you're able to give over to all of your students. And the people don't even know yet that they're going to be your students. And you teach Torah to Am Yisrael, mamash mitoch ahava.
Well, firstly, I'm humbled and thank you. I'd say one quick story. Because there was a conversation about you don't know that happened about 1.5 years ago when I went to Johannesburg because I was helping the King David School Network with their curricula, and I stayed at Melissa Mark Chipkin. And not long after I entered the house, they said, "Do you know?" I saw all your books in a prominent place in their shelves, and you reference them in your introduction. And in your Torah means so much to so many people, but in some places I've never been, and I think they've been studying works before you'd necessarily had contact with them. There was this profound connection with the ideas that you've written and shared, and it really filled a void, and it meant so much to them. And it was so nice to see people so enthusiastic about you stayed there, I believe, right? Having being able to host you as a Torah teacher who had guided them and inspired them so much. So I thought I'd just tell you that while standing by their bookshelves, walking past with my suitcase on Erev Shabbos. And that was the first remark they made. And it came from such a beautiful place because your Torah is so beautiful to them and so many others.
Okay. Thank you for your time.
Good to see you, and be well.
Okay.
Look after yourself. Kol tov.